Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast where we explore the history and heritage of England's towns and cities. Now, normally in each episode, we take you on a journey through the streets, the stories, and buildings and structures that shaped our urban landscape and how that history is celebrated today. But in this episode, we're taking a little detour. No city guide this time. We're talking trains. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know we love trains and railways on this podcast. It's one of our top topics. I'm Lee McGrath, and I'm joined once again by historian Daniel Gooch. Hello, Daniel. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, Liam. And I'm very excited because the tables are turning slightly in this episode. Normally it's you asking me the questions, but it's a rare occasion where you're the expert and I get to learn about a new topic from you and ask a few questions. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh, gosh, feeling the pressure now. So absolutely. Normally I try and come up with interesting questions to provoke Daniel to tell us about the hidden histories of cities and towns in England. And today we're having a special episode because we're talking about the history of urban transport in Britain, and in particular, why there's not many underground metro systems. So our last episode was on Nottingham, and it sparked quite a lot of conversations. I had some interesting conversations online about Nottingham Victoria Station. Could you just quickly remind us about Nottingham Victoria Station, what we covered there?
Yes, certainly. So Nottingham Victoria Station was a huge mainline railway station in the middle of Nottingham. But when the line closed and the trains dried up, essentially almost all of it got demolished. You've got your clock tower left, but that's basically it. And now you have the Victoria Centre, one of the two main shopping centres of Nottingham, sitting on the same site today. But you do still have some of the tunnels running underneath the city that used to bring the trains in right underneath the city centre. So there's still some good urban exploration there to be had.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. Philip on Blue Sky was talking about the history of the destinations served by that station, like all over the country. He listed a whole load of stations you could get to, whole places in the country you could get to from Victoria Station, as places as diverse as Newcastle to Poole. And the line that ran through there was designed for speed. It was constructed in such a way, but it was a quick railway for its age. The radii of the track were always over a mile to ensure decent speeds. So it's quite a loss that line doesn't exist anymore, both for Nottingham and general north-south connections. Another bit of feedback I had was from a resident who said, I need to go back to Nottingham because I've not seen it lately. I think I went on a rant about the Broadmarsh shopping centre, which doesn't exist anymore. But I think you've been there more recently and can tell us what that looks like now.
Yeah, I went back about a week and a half ago. I have to say, it's not the first time I've seen this area since the demolition, but it's absolutely unrecognisable. I just can't get my bearings walking down from the station to where you used to walk through the Broadmarsh Centre, through the bus station, into the city centre. A number of times I've seen it, I just feel like I'm in a different city at that point. It's absolutely uncanny the way they've demolished it, and you're looking at almost a completely different city at that point.
No, it's extraordinary. I need to get back. I gather there's a park right there in the centre.
Yeah.
That used to be the let's be honest, horribly ugly concrete Broadmarsh Centre, an old Arndale Centre. And another topic, I think a few people have said this to me now, is you need to do a topic on an episode on these sort of post-war shopping centre retail-driven developments, because they've shaped so many British city centres. So one for the future.
The excuse to visit Milton Keynes.
We're going to do Milton Keynes anyway, because we're going to do a series on new sounds at some point. So yeah, thank you to everyone for feedback. We love hearing memories, actually, people who actually remember what places look like and how they've changed. So any feedback and observations, always welcomed. But it was our last couple of episodes on Nottingham and Liverpool that really got us thinking about the rail networks in those cities and in other cities we've been to. And in particular, really in the UK, not many cities have underground metros in the way that European cities do. And we thought, well, why not? What's the history of this? What's the reason for this in terms of the history of how our cities in the UK have developed? So we're going to have an exploration of that in this special episode.
Excellent. Right. So I'm very interested to learn about this. I'd like to know, before we get into the detail of all the reasons. Can you explain briefly what is the metro situation in the UK today, and just as a quick overview, why are there so few of them?
World famous is the London Underground. Everyone knows that. You've seen the roundel, and it's a symbol of London. And London Underground is famous for being the first metro system. It opened in 1863, the first line, and that's now the section that you can ride between Paddington and Farringdon on the Circle Line. And yet, despite this pioneering role, the UK has surprisingly few metro systems. So beyond London, there's only really 3 other cities where you can say there's a metro system, and they're all quite small systems. They're in Glasgow, Liverpool, and Newcastle, Tyne and Wear, more accurately. And this is in contrast to other cities like Germany, France, or Spain, or Japan, which have built metro systems in many of their larger cities in the second half of the 20th century. There are some grey areas in the definitions, right? But there are approximately 6 metro systems in France, 7 in Italy, 3 in Spain, maybe more if you include Seville's underground trams, 7 in Russia. Japan has loads, probably about 20, and there's been an explosion in metros in Asia, particularly in China, since the first was built in Beijing in 1971. So at least 40 systems. Most have just expanded enormously in the last 20 years. India's built a lot in recent years, since Delhi opened in 2003. Calcutta's actually a bit old, from 1984. South Korea has 6. But these Asian cities are just so difficult to compare with Europe because the population densities are much higher. These are vast cities. So I find it easier to compare with European countries like Italy, Germany, France, Spain. Those European countries have got more systems because beyond London, the UK systems are small. London is still one of the top cities in the world for rail transit, but beyond that, they are small systems. I think there's 3 reasons, groups of reasons that I'd give you for why we don't have as many in the UK, and we'll explore these. I think critically, there's something around urban form and the density of our cities, how they've developed, is something we talk about a lot in this podcast. Secondly, I think there's just the history of railways in general in the UK, in particular suburban railways in cities. And then finally, big theme is investment choices and policy choices in the second half of the 20th century, where we just didn't build these metro systems.
One question here would be, when we say metro system, what exactly do we mean by metro system? Because there are some other cities in the UK which have kind of metropolitan transport systems like trams or buses, or certain kinds of railways like you have in Cardiff that go around the city. What exactly do we mean by a metro system here?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it's not clearly defined. I think we'd all have an understanding that a metro system, it's a train service where you're turning up at the station, you're not waiting more than 10 minutes perhaps for a train to show up. They're frequently coming through. They're high capacity, typically underground. The only real definitions I can find are from the International Association of Public Transport, which defines a metro as a high-capacity urban rail system with exclusive right-of-way, meaning it's fully separated from other traffic. And ISO 37120, which is a standard for indicators of cities' success and well-being, well, that includes metro systems under urban mobility and infrastructure, emphasising capacity and separations from other traffic. So that separation is key. I've done analysis of capacity per hour of UK metro lines, how many people they can move per hour per direction. The big London lines can shift about 30,000 to 40,000 per hour. Victoria line, Northern line, Central line, the Elizabeth line can shift that many. The Elizabeth line can shift about 45,000 per hour. The lines in Liverpool, the Northern line, the Wirral line, if they're running full frequency and full length trains, about 10 to 15,000 per hour. The Glasgow subway has really small trains, so it's only about 6,000 per hour. And the UK tram systems, with the exception of Manchester, are all about that capacity or lower, so around 5,000 per hour, so much lower capacity than a fully segregated metro. Manchester is quite high because it has some very high frequencies coming in to the city centre, particularly from the west around Cornbrook, where it is fully separated. So Manchester's quite an exceptional system in that way.
Right, okay, so we're talking about something that can move lots of people and essentially where you don't have to look up the timetable before you go. You just know there's going to be something that's there. Excellent. Thank you. So now we're clear on that. So are you able to tell us a bit more about the metro systems we do have? So the ones that have bucked the trend, it'd be interesting to understand how they came to be.
Yes, that's right. So London has by far largest and most developed system, over 270 stations in the city centre, and most of inner London, they're underground, and they're all operating at high frequencies. So easily fitting that definition, some of them extremely high frequencies. The Victorian line, for example, is operating at 36 trains per hour, and there's other lines operating at 30 trains per hour. So high capacity. London also has the Docklands Light Railway, which is a metro system by my definition. Mostly elevated, though. It has some underground sections, particularly under the River Thames, and it has some underground stations. London also has the London Overground, which again has high frequencies and underground sections. And it also has two lines which are not strictly speaking part of the London Underground, but they operate high frequency, high capacity routes. The Elizabeth line and Thameslink, which are comparable with Paris RER or Berlin's S-Bahn or S-Bahns you see in German cities.
Yeah, so I live right at the edge of the Crossrail route in Reading, and I'd say it kind of has a bit of the characteristics of both the normal rail system and the metro system. It feels to me like if you're in the centre of London where everything converges, you're in basically a metro system there. But when you get to the outskirts in Reading, it is more of a look up the timetable and rather than a turn up and go type system, although not many people be using it to get all the way to London anyway.
This is where the definitions become blurred, right? You could also say that about parts of the London Underground. If you go to the northwestern reaches of the Metropolitan line or the northeastern reaches of the Central line, actually the frequencies could get quite low on those branches, and they're serving quite suburban areas, low density housing. And we'll come back to this whole urban form issue, because that's partly why we don't have so many metro systems, because of the relatively low densities of suburban British cities. Outside of London, as I say, the networks are quite small. Glasgow has the UK's second oldest system, and indeed one of the oldest systems in the world. Came after Chicago and Budapest. Well, it's about the same time as Budapest, actually. Opened in 1896 and is one line that goes in a circle under the city centre and the inner western suburbs of Glasgow. And it's never expanded. But Glasgow is quite interesting from a rail situation because it has an extensive suburban rail network, including two underground suburban rail lines, which are reasonably high frequency, about 6 trains an hour. Wouldn't really call it metro lines, but you definitely suburban rail lines. Glasgow is an interesting city because Glasgow and Edinburgh, the big Scottish cities, sort of have a different urban form from English cities. They have denser inner suburbs, tenement buildings, 4 or 5 stories high, covering a broader area. So Glasgow is quite exceptional in that sense. Another city with what we're defining as a metro system, and a city we discussed recently, is Liverpool. And Liverpool has a rich rail history, and lots of railways crisscrossed Liverpool during railway mania. It was one of the most important cities in Britain in the 19th century and had an extensive railway system. And indeed, it had an elevated rail network along its docks, which you'll recall from our Liverpool episode. We talked about that quite a bit. But that's no longer there. That's completely gone. There's no trace of it, I don't think. There's a little bit in the Liverpool or Museum of Liverpool. And that was an overhead railway. But what is left is in the 1970s, it was decided to join up several of Liverpool's suburban rail lines in an underground loop under the city centre. And that incorporates the rail tunnel under the Mersey to Birkenhead. And that's given a network of 2 metro lines, the Wirral line and the Northern line. There's a third line that's included in the brand of Mersey Rail, City Line, which runs into Liverpool Lime Street. But that does give us an underground high-frequency metro system under Liverpool and Birkenhead. And indeed, Liverpool Central is the busiest underground station in the UK outside London.
Yeah, I'd definitely add what you said on the Museum of Liverpool. The reconstruction of the overhead railway station is great there because it's done essentially across two levels. You can be on the ground floor, and you have kind of an entrance there, and you have the station above you, which you can access from the floor above you. It's really well done. So I think the final one you mentioned was originally Newcastle, more correctly Tyne and Wear Metro. Was that's the one?
Yeah, so Tyne and Wear Metro, like Liverpool, used parts of old railway alignments, but built tunnels under the city centre. So that's under Newcastle city centre and under Gateshead, which is just just south of the Tyne, and that's now been extended to Sunderland. So it incorporates Sunderland, it incorporates several towns and cities, and it's due an expansion to Washington as well. So that's a decent system in Tyne and Wear that opened in 1980.
So that's what we do have. Numerically speaking, it's not a lot. So where are the big gaps? Can you tell us about some of the major cities and towns in England that don't have metros, and what they might have instead in the way of transportation?
So the biggest urban regions beyond those that we've mentioned are Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, West Yorkshire, the towns around Leeds, Nottingham, Sheffield, Edinburgh. These are big cities by European standards, are big urban regions. Now, Manchester, Birmingham, Nottingham, Sheffield, Edinburgh do have modern tram systems. So they have high frequency, high capacity public transport. But for cities of their size, you'd probably expect them to have true metro systems.
And that's interesting with Manchester because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of their tram systems going to the outskirts of Manchester run on old railway lines, don't they? Those converter lines.
Yes.
Okay.
So Manchester's an interesting one because in the city centre, it resembles definitely a tram system. There's on-street running. But as you say, it's taken over rail lines to the towns that form a ring around Greater Manchester. So Greater Manchester's an interesting conurbation. You've got Manchester in the centre and Salford in the centre, but then you've got towns like Rochdale, Oldham, Bury that have the tram extending to those towns on former railway alignments. But it's Leeds. Leeds is the city that people always quote when people are talking about the lack of public transport in UK cities. Leeds is the interesting one because Leeds doesn't have anything yet. It has suburban railway lines around Leeds and around West Yorkshire, but there isn't a high frequency tram or metro system in Leeds.
Yeah, I've travelled to the outskirts of Leeds a couple of times on trains, and you're right. It definitely is not anything resembling a metropolitan urban transport system. It's very much a normal train service that you have to look up the timetable for and be aware of when it's coming. No question at all.
Well, Leeds. A couple of examples in Leeds. Yeah. If we were going to football at Elland Road, how would you get there? You'd sort of walk along.
Taxi walk, exactly.
Probably taxi. If you're going to cricket at Headingley, there is a station, but you're looking up the train times and it's not a high capacity route.
No, exactly. If you're going out to Burley Park, I think it is, or Headingley with a couple, then that's what I have done before. And certainly you have to be aware of what you're doing, no question. Cool. So thank you. That's a great overview. Now, talk about kind of the focus of the episode, why there are so few. You mentioned three main reasons why cities in the UK are generally so poorly served by metropolitan rail systems. The first, I think you said, was to do with the urban design of British cities. Can you tell us more about what we mean by that, how that's impacted the availability of these things?
Well, and you'll be able to help me out here because, of course, we're doing a series in the podcast about the sort of the incremental growth of UK cities, their origins, and how the layers of British cities have grown. But I think this is a key explainer for why we don't have these metro systems. So a key thing is that the ranking of Britain's largest cities changed dramatically in the Industrial Revolution. So we've spoken before on this podcast, before the Industrial Revolution, okay, London's always been the most important city, but the biggest cities were places like Norwich, Bristol, and what became the biggest cities in the Industrial Revolution, Manchester, and then Birmingham, those big cities that grew at Nottingham, which we last covered, that they weren't big before the Industrial Revolution. So their historic urban cores are relatively small, particularly if you compare with London, where the pre-industrial core is quite extensive, and the only way of getting through that is to go underneath. So if you think of those cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, if you go to those cities today, you still see this pattern of dense central city centre, but then like a ring of relatively low density. You really see it in Birmingham. If you go to the Bullring shopping centre and you look out across Digbeth, it's low density industrial. It's the workshop of the world. It's something to be proud of. It was light industrial and jewellery quarter as well, another example of that. And these densities are just not enough to sustain what modern metro systems, just not enough activity. And you see that in all those cities. And then what you see, Birmingham's such a good example for this.
No, I'd agree. I'd agree. If you, sorry, I always bring it back to football, but if you do that walk from New Street Station out to St Andrews, Birmingham City's ground, you are going through lots of old industrial areas, stuff that really isn't, a lot of land that really isn't used for very much. It's not very densely populated or used. So yeah, I definitely get that impression when I'm there.
And of course, if you tried to develop a business case for a metro station in Digbeth, well, it just wouldn't get enough use, so it just wouldn't be justifiable. And I think the next stage in those layers of a British city is the interwar, so 1930s and then post Second World War sprawl, semi-detached houses with large gardens. Again, doesn't have the density, but also very car orientated. Everyone has a drive. The expectation that you would use your car, ultimately multiple cars for a lot of families, and again, it just makes the high capacity metro systems less viable. So I think that urban form is a big part of the reason for this, and we talk about it a lot in the podcast. It's British cities, medieval core. I think you're going to do an episode on Stuart and Georgian expansion, but that's a relatively small geographical space. And then British cities sprawl in the 20th century, and that sprawl, which is vast, really, and that's what makes the cities so big, but not at a density that's high enough for metros. If you contrast that with French cities, German cities, particularly Spanish cities, everyone lives in flats. The British are much more likely to have houses with gardens.
Yeah, so I suppose it all kind of links to our ideas of urban renewal. It isn't necessarily building flats for people to live in. People have this dream of going out to the suburbs. Like we saw in Nottingham, in our Nottingham episode, we looked at how Nottingham grew outwards at such a high rate following industrialisation, following the 19th century, taking in all these suburbs which grew and grew and grew. And you can really see that in aerial photos of all these British cities, can't you?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yes.
So that was reason number one. Thank you. The second reason you mentioned was this legacy, I think predominantly Victorian legacy of other systems of urban transport. You've got overground railways and trams. Can you tell us about that and specifically what the impact of that was on the development or lack of development of metro systems in the UK?
Well, we've got to keep in mind that during the Industrial Revolution, when the second-tier cities, your Birminghams, your Manchesters, your Leeds, became huge and of international industrial significance, at this time, Britain was the richest country in the world. By GDP per capita, it was the vanguard of industrialisation. And as a result, in the UK, more railways were built all across cities. And this came with industrialisation. So in the 19th century, we experienced this period known as railway mania. We've discussed this on the podcast before. We've done the Swindon episode, and miles of track were laid across the country. And in cities, this was as true as it was anywhere else. So in any British city, you will find big suburban rail networks or former a suburban rail network. Some of them have been taken up and are now, nice parks you can walk through. Some of them are built over. But the point is, suburban rail networks were developed, and you can see this in the structures of cities. If you go to Manchester, there's a big railway line on a viaduct on the south of the city centre. You get this in a lot of cities where you'll see these big suburban rail structures. And if you look at the development of the far-reaching metro lines in London, so the Metropolitan line or the top of the Northern line or far reaches of the Central line, they were built as overland suburban rail networks, really. They're not true underground metro systems. And that's to serve these expanding, relatively low density suburbs. And so a lot of cities, you do see these suburban rail networks. In the Nottingham episode, you spoke about a suburban line in northeast Nottingham that's since closed. But all cities have them. The Severn Beach line in Bristol is a good example. Cardiff, which you mentioned earlier, has extensive suburban rail networks. The drawback of these is they're usually quite low frequency.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I mean, when my wife grew up in Cardiff, they would get the train into town. But to be honest, I think it was almost as easy sometimes to get the bus, just because they would turn up just even more frequently and sometimes be a bit cheaper. So there is that competition there if you don't have the high frequency.
Yes, and Cardiff's an interesting place because Cardiff has a really extensive suburban rail network, and the lines go right up to the valleys, and that's sort of tied in with the industrial history. We're going to have to do Wales at some point on the podcast because Cardiff and the valleys are just so fascinating. I mean, interestingly, in Cardiff, there is a project now to try and metroise those lines to turn them into something resembling a metro, but it's difficult because the lines are just not built for it. But it's also worth saying a lot of cities, pretty much all UK cities and towns, had tram systems. And they're not like the tram systems we know now. These were kind of rickety old things by today's standards. But everywhere had sort of narrow gauge tram systems, or light, what we would regard now as lighter tram systems, which would cover the Victorian urban fabric as we'd see it today.
It's almost something, if you want a modern equivalent, maybe the old cable car system in San Francisco, that kind of rickety old thing, sometimes with 2 floors, you climb up on the outside from the top. You're absolutely right. It's not the kind of modern, sleek, plastic glass and metal kind of tram system you'd think of today that we had back then.
No, and they evolved from horse-drawn trams, and then they were electrified. But they were absolutely vast. I mean, every town and city had them. Transport historian Peter Waller, in his series on the lost tramways of England, describes this incredible example of the ability to get by tram via a continuous network from Liverpool's Pierhead all the way to Rochdale. And that's quite a long way.
Yeah, that really is.
Interconnected towns and cities, but the track was there. So you really did have a lot of urban transport back then, but it wasn't metros.
Great. So what happened to all these trams? Why are they? We have some, but definitely not as many as we used to have.
Well, the trams, the technology was obsolete. I think Ipswich, our hometown, is a great example. The Ipswich trams were in a shocking state by the 1920s, and they were ridiculed in the town. You can see some old newspaper cuttings of cartoons of people sort of falling off broken trams. And, like in every other town, they were replaced by buses. Ipswich went through a period of having electric trolley buses, but even those were replaced by diesel motor buses, which were considered cheaper, more flexible, didn't need the infrastructure. But you do have a legacy of these tram systems. Pretty much any town will have the old tram depots. They're often now bus depots. Some of them have been turned into, pubs. In Ipswich, it's the Transport Museum.
So I suppose this brings us onto point 3, doesn't it? The third part of the answer. You mentioned the kind of the political side of transport investment in the UK, specific government policy and investment decisions that I'm guessing veered away from metros. Can you tell us why, what happened, and what was, if not metro systems, what was envisioned as the transport future for British cities?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely key because to be fair, those things I spoke about before, Britain Britain was on the vanguard of metro, certainly in London, but it wasn't like other cities around the world were building metro systems. Only the biggest cities, Paris, Budapest, I've mentioned, New York, obviously Tokyo was fairly early, but essentially most of the metro systems that were built in Europe were built in the second half of the 20th century. So the question is, why didn't they get built in Britain in the second half of the 20th century? And this does come down to policy and investment. And I think that the main driver of that was just a shift in policy towards a car-based future, that cities would have large urban freeways and car parks, and people would drive. And if you look at the larger British cities, they all had major urban highways built. So Birmingham famously built concentric motorway rings. The innermost one was renowned. It was called the Concrete Collar. It's mostly demolished now. If you go to Birmingham, it's been taken out, but the middle way is still there. Other cities had similar ring roads. Coventry, our first podcast episode, had inner motorway completed in 1974. But this was part of the image of Coventry. We spoke when we did the Coventry episode, Daimler and Rover, big car manufacturing companies in Birmingham and Coventry. So it was sort of part of the vision of these cities that you would drive, and the infrastructure would be there to go with it. And this, of course, led to separation of cars from people, and Coventry had its urban precinct in the bombed-out city centre, which separated people from cars. And in that era, we saw those shopping centres that we've spoken about that we don't like, with big car parks joining onto dual carriageways. But all the major cities did it. Manchester constructed the Mancunian Way across the south of the city centre. That's a raised urban highway. Leeds has very impressive inner ring road, which goes partly underground underneath the university in the city centre, and it has a tangle of motorways to the south of the city centre that have had a huge impact. Newcastle built a central motorway, again similar to Leeds, got it kind of carving its way through, and Glasgow built the M8 through the city centre, which is a huge motorway through the city centre. And even cities that didn't build full-blown motorways built dual carriageways. So Bristol, it's extraordinary to think of it today, but Queen Square in Bristol, which is this beautiful Georgian square, had a dual carriageway cutting across the centre diagonally. And with Nottingham, we discussed the last episode, Maid Marian Way, dual carriageway right there in the city centre.
There's an example near me, if you want an example in smaller places. In Reading, look at an aerial map of Reading. You'll see the A33 that cuts through the town centre has a strange bend, a strange curve to it. And that's actually because it follows the exact line of an old railway line that used to go there, very, very close to my house. You can actually, if you look at aerial photos on Google Maps, you can very easily see where the bank of the old railway line carried on and went off towards Basingstoke. Now, it was only a goods line, but it almost sort of is characteristic of this move towards cars being seen as the future, and cars kind of taking over where metros and railways perhaps could have been.
Look at aerial photography of any city, or just go on Google Maps, and you see these former railway alignments. Some of them have become roads. It's quite frequent. Some of them have become walkways. But yes, it's quite common in British cities.
Excellent. So while this was happening in the UK, what was happening in other countries? I think you've mentioned there was investment in metros. Can you give us a few examples of what was being created?
Yes, I think this is the interesting thing for me. Whilst this was going on in the UK, I think other countries were building urban highways, but they also seem to be building metro systems. And this comes back to that initial point I made on the urban form, because the inner cities of European cities were denser. Perhaps there was a stronger case for it, but also possibly it was just a policy decision. But if you look at France, the second tier cities in France got metro systems. Marseille in 1977, Lyon in 1978, Lille 1983, Toulouse 1993. And those cities, they're big, impressive cities, but, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds are of similar scale to those cities. Germany was expanding U-Bahns, Munich, Nuremberg in the 70s. Italy, Rome 1955, Milan 1964. Japan built numerous metro systems in the 70s. and 80s, the Soviet Union had a policy of, if a city had a population of 1 million, it deserved a metro system. So they built lots of metro systems, and that's left a legacy of lots of metro systems across Russia and Ukraine. So cities, Nizhny Novgorod, Samara, Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipro, which are cities which are similar in scale really to the biggest UK cities. They've got metro systems. Even the United States, renowned for its car culture, and like Britain, even more sprawling than Britain in terms of its suburbia, big houses and gardens. Even in the US, cities got metros, most famously Washington, D.C., which got an extraordinary metro system in 1976, and San Francisco, which got the BART. What I would say about the US systems, to be fair, those cities are much bigger. The economies of Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, comparable with London rather than Manchester. So the European city comparisons are the ones that I would make, but definitely cities of similar scale to Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham were getting metros in incomparably wealthy European countries.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm just wondering, just as a sort of aside on this, so do we know who was making the decision and who was ultimately driving the funding for this, and who would have done it in the UK? So if talk about the Soviet Union, presumably it's a communist state. Presumably that's a centrally planned government decision. That policy and the funding will be quite easily to sort centrally as well. Do we know, was it the same in other countries? Was it locally sourced funding? Was there ever a private investment element? And would that have been particularly different in the UK at this time if anything had happened?
Well, because of the payback period on metro systems, it's almost always state funded. It's normally centrally state. In terms of funding, France has the versement transport, which is a local payroll tax on employees working for companies with over 11 employees, and that has part-funded rail transport. Germany had the Municipal Transport Financing Act, which has a very long German name I won't try to say, that has provided extra federal funding to the regions, and the regions created integrated transport authorities. France and Spain also had public-private partnerships. The UK has done that to an extent. Parts of the DLR expansions were funded this way. A lot of it's about policy. Countries like France had more of a policy focus on rail and regional development. Germany created integrated transport authorities in the 60s and 70s. And Britain really went the opposite way. We privatised and deregulated buses and trains in the 80s and 90s. And, much of this can be explained by the differences in the politics of these nations in this period. It's partly about some of those factors I've talked about before, about lower densities, urban form, availability of suburban rail. Perhaps Britain favoured car-focused projects because Britain had North Sea oil, and perhaps it would have been cheaper to encourage driving here compared with countries like Germany without the oil dividend. The Transit Costs Project is an online project, open data project, which you can look up. It compares hundreds of metro projects looking at costs. I think it was born out of the outrageous costs of New York's Second Avenue subway. The UK has a small sample size in this, but averages $887 million per kilometre, which is enormous, some of the highest costs in the world. And that compares with $150 million per kilometre in Spain, Portugal, South Korea, Finland and Turkey. So that's 887 versus 150. So it's a staggering difference. And there might be some good specific reasons for that, but it's still a staggering difference. France and Germany are about 400 million, so half the cost of the UK. UK and US have exceptionally high costs. And it's just part of a broader theme of lower investment in the UK. And arguably this is tied in with productivity. So if you look at some of those countries I mentioned that built metro systems, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, that built lots of metro systems in the 60s, 70s, 80s, those countries had economic miracles, extremely high rates of growth in the second half of the 20th century. Britain had growth, but not as high as those countries. So either the metros contributed to the growth, or the growth gave them the money to build the metros. That's you need to find an economist to tell you which of those is the right explanation.
I'm sure there's a PhD in there somewhere if no one's done it yet. So we've identified this critical post-war period for other countries in metro building. Did the UK get anything in that period?
Yeah, we did, but it's small scale. So I mentioned Merseyrail. So in the late 70s, the suburban lines in the Liverpool region being combined into a loop under the city centre and the metro system. We got Tyne and Wear Metro in 1980. London got incremental expansions, and I actually think it's quite surprising how little was built in London in this period. Actually, you always think of London, it's got this huge system. A lot of the huge system of London was built before the Second World War. London got the Victoria line in 1968 and the Jubilee line 1979. It got extended in 1999. You might remember the Millennium Dome and all that, and the Jubilee line extension. And I remember
it being a big deal. Yeah, even as a child, it was a big deal to people. The Jubilee line extension.
It was, and it's still impressive today. And we got the Docklands Light Railway in that period as well. That period of renewal of the London Docklands, which goes on today. But for an economy the size of Britain's, bear in mind, second half of the 20th century, it's the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. That's not many metro lines being built.
No.
But what we have had more recently is investment in modern trams, nowhere near as much as France or Germany or Belgium or anywhere else, but we have had some modern trams in Manchester, first of all, in the early 90s, Sheffield, Nottingham, which we covered on the Nottingham episode, South London, the Croydon area got a tram, Birmingham has got a single tram line that's not particularly frequent or good in my view, but it's okay. It's there. Midlands Metro, and most recently Edinburgh's got a tram line. Relatively small systems by European standards. Oh, and I should mention Blackpool, of course. I should have said this earlier. Blackpool's the only city that's maintained a tram line throughout. It's maintained its historic tram line, and it's recently had a small extension to the station. It's had its tram fleet overhauled. But these are relatively small investments compared with comparable countries in Europe. And I keep saying comparable countries, by the way, because if you bring China into the mix, it's just off the scale. About 50 cities have metro systems in China. So you can't even compare. But compared to sort of Western European countries, definitely less investment in these kind of systems.
Of course. Now, that's really interesting. And certainly there is development now in tram systems. When I went back to Nottingham after a few years, I could see the extra extension to university that would have been very useful had I been there as a student. And in other cities as well, you can see tram development. But beyond that, so looking into the future, is there any sign of larger scale proper metro system development in the UK? Is there any prospect that we might one day start building these things on the same scale as our European neighbours do?
Well, I think in terms of the policy and cultural changes that you need for this, the answer is yes. So the environmental movement has shifted the perspective on using cars to move around cities, as has congestion and other arguments around well-being. So I think there's more of a consensus now that we should have metro systems. Also, I think the culture of having a house and a big garden, while still prevalent in the UK, is less, it has softened somewhat. I think people are more prepared to live in flats than they used to be. So you are seeing higher densities in the redevelopments of British inner cities. So in some senses, yes, we are moving in the right direction, and the government seems to be interested in funding light rail extensions and tram extensions. So Newcastle is Tyne and Wear Metro is being extended to Washington. There's funding for various tram extensions. Manchester has several extensions planned, and Liverpool's got a new station opening at the Baltic Quarter and plans for more. So there's definitely a sense that we should be doing these things. But now our problem in the UK is cost. So it costs several times more to build metros in the UK than, say, Spain or France. There seems to be an anglophone problem with building rail infrastructure. Costs in the UK, North America and Australia seem to be far higher than France, Spain. And it means that it's very difficult to build these things, and lots of thinking about why this is. It's something to do with how we procure these projects, governance, centralisation in the UK is clearly a problem. Land acquisition costs in the UK are clearly a problem. And there's an issue around standardisation. So in Spain, they've got highly standardised approaches, and it means that they can build these things much more cheaply. So you can go to a mid-sized Spanish city like Bilbao, and there's a metro system, and you think, well, if Bilbao's got one, why not Leeds? Why not Bristol? And they're able to do things more cheaply. But we are getting marginal improvements. Leeds is planning a system. Birmingham's expanding the Midland Metro. As I say, Manchester and Liverpool are expanding, but these are relatively modest additions. There's no plan that I'm aware of for a substantial new metro line or system in the UK.
Listen, so I'm just going to ask you, I've got one last question for you, unless there's anything else you want to add on to this. I'm going to put you on the spot. You're the Minister for Transport. You've got the backing of the Prime Minister. You've got an almost limitless budget, and you're allowed one project and one project only. What are you doing?
Oh, such a good question. I have the answer in my mind immediately. So Seoul, which has an enormous metro system, by the way, size of London's, but all built post-Korean War, so like really modern. They're building like a high-speed, limited-stop metro system, and I think that kind of technology would naturally fit on the Liverpool, Manchester Airport, Manchester, probably somewhere like Rochdale, Huddersfield, Bradford, Leeds corridor. And I would have trains going at relatively high speed between those places, but throw in Halifax if you can, whatever the alignment, but join up those places so that they are one big agglomerated economy. Because this is the key thing, right? If you're a country like Britain, you haven't got big manufacturing industries in the way you used to. You're relying on high wage, knowledge-based industries, and those industries are more productive in these large cities, these large city regions. It's why American cities are so productive, because they're big city regions. That's what you need to make that part of Britain as productive as its peers in Germany, North America, and other parts of Europe. So that would be my project.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for all that. I really enjoyed that. We should put you in the chair more often on Ye Olde Guide.
Oh God, no. No, it's hard work. Too many rabbit holes.
That's true. You have to.
Far too many rabbit holes. But anyway, I think we need to talk about the next episode, because I think it kind of ties in with this, because I spoke about the urban form of British cities. So this is the interesting thing. British cities, the ones with the big historic urban cores, stopped growing by and large, apart from London. So I'm talking about Norwich in mind when I say this, which I think is what you're going to be talking about in the next episode, because you're going to be talking about the expansion of cities in the post-medieval period. Is that the best way to describe it?
Yeah, so we're going to look very broadly at the Tudor and Stuart period of urban development in England. Essentially, the Tudor and Stuart town is what we're going to be looking at. And without wanting to give too much away, I think it's a really overlooked but important period of British urban development. It's this crucial link, I think, between this medieval period of modern timber, which you probably have in your mind, and the latest ideas of maybe Regency and Georgian towns, which are grander, built in stone, and the larger, sprawling industrial Victorian urban cities. It's important because it's at this point when you get the earliest ideas of modern neoclassical town planning, but more than that, really, a kind of revolution in the fabric of buildings themselves. This is when brick started to be used. What's the number one ingredient in towns, in residential areas of English cities today? It's brick. It's the earliest time when towns started to look a bit like they do today in that very basic way. So I'm really looking forward to that.
No, that sounds fascinating. And which towns do you think are going to be heavily focused on, if you had to pick some out?
We have a few. Lavenham is one that springs to mind. We'll give Lavenham in Suffolk a good bit of a shout out there.
Very nice.
That's
tiny town now. Is it even a town?
It kind of hovers that line between a town and a village, but it's got some great stuff, some great remnants of Tudor and Stuart England there. It's Guildhall, some of the houses there. It's been used in filming in the famous film The Witchfinder General with Vincent Price. It was used to stand in for your classic Stuart town that was around in that time and didn't need much changing to it. So yeah, that's one of the places, but there will be more. We'll go through more of them in the episode.
Brilliant. I can't wait. Well, thank you for listening to this special episode of UK Metro Systems. Britain invented the Metro, so why did it stop? I hope you've enjoyed it, and please tune in for the next episode on the development of English towns and cities. If you have any comments, please do get in touch. You can visit our website, yeoldeguide.com. Please do leave a rating or review at wherever you get your podcasts, and please do get in touch and do join in for this next episode on the growth of English towns and cities. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks a lot for listening.